Imagine strolling through sun-drenched Athens in 430 BC. Everywhere you look, you see drinking vessels decorated with wildly explicit erotic scenes, penises, orgies, and sexual positions that would shock modern eyes. It looks like one massive, never-ending orgy where everyone's permanently horny. But the truth is quite different from what you might think. The ancient Greeks weren't just randomly going wild with sex. They had elaborate rules, sacred rituals, and complex philosophical justifications for every twisted practice. Today we're diving deep into the most disturbing sexual customs of ancient Greece. From public masturbation as philosophical duty to temple prostitution, Greece was a civilization where practices we'd call criminal today formed the foundation of their so-called enlightened society. Let's step into this marble paradise and explore the shocking sexual realities behind the civilization that claimed to birth Western culture. So let's start with the first practice that will blow your mind. You're strolling through the bustling Athenian marketplace, browsing pottery and fresh olives, when suddenly everyone around you freezes in shock. There, right in front of families with young children, stands the respected philosopher Diogenes, publicly engaging in self-stimulation as if he's delivering a lecture. You can't believe what you're seeing, but this is actually happening. This wasn't madness. Diogenes was one of Greece's most respected philosophers, and his public self-stimulation was considered legitimate philosophical argument. For most Greeks, this practice meant barbarism, slavery, lack of control. The word dephesthai meant to soften, implying self-pleasure literally made men weak and effeminate. Greek art depicted only satyrs, slaves, and barbarians as engaging in this, never civilized citizens. To be Greek meant controlled, dominant. This behavior marked you as someone so low you couldn't find a proper partner, woman, slave, or beautiful boy. But Diogenes shattered this system through scandal. When confronted about his public display, he'd respond, "If only it were as easy to banish hunger by rubbing my belly." His point was devastating. If intimate desire was natural as hunger, why should satisfying it be shameful? Citizens gathered to watch his performances, some horrified, others fascinated. Archaeological evidence reveals hundreds of vases depicting this practice despite official disapproval. Women's self-pleasure was treated differently. Medical writers claimed women needed it for health, leading to widespread intimate devices sold openly in markets, even given as wedding gifts. Here's what destroys your faith in their enlightenment. Children were required to witness these philosophical demonstrations of self-pleasure. Wealthy families paid enormous sums for front-row positions, believing that watching the philosopher's physical conclusion would teach essential lessons about human nature. Imagine explaining to your 5-year-old why the holy man needs to pleasure himself publicly and why this represents the pinnacle of Greek wisdom. You thought public self-stimulation was peak philosophical corruption. Wait until you see how Greeks turned intimate encounters with strangers into the most sacred religious duty. Picture this. Your legs are burning as you climb the steep rocky path to Corinth's famous temple complex. When you finally reach the top, what you see defies everything you thought you knew about ancient religion. Over 1,000 women completely dedicated to sexual service as sacred prostitutes. You're not just looking at a temple, you're witnessing the economic engine that makes an entire city wealthy through systematized holy sex. These weren't ordinary prostitutes. They were hierodolai, sacred servants, whose sexual acts were religious rituals. When merchants paid for their services, they participated in ceremonies honoring Aphrodite through physical love. The operation was staggering. Thousands of women serving visitors from across the Mediterranean. Ships docked specifically so crews could make sexual pilgrimages. The saying, "The voyage to Corinth is not for every man," referred to both the expensive cost and transformative religious experience. The women came from diverse backgrounds. Beautiful slaves donated by wealthy Greeks believing Aphrodite would grant prosperity in return. Free women could dedicate themselves temporarily, believing offering their bodies to strangers ensured fertility in marriage. The sexual rituals were elaborate affairs in special chambers decorated with Aphrodite's love scenes, with incense burning and priestesses performing purification before and after each encounter. Payment wasn't just financial, it was spiritual currency funding public works throughout Corinth. Similar temples operated across the Greek world, adapting local traditions while maintaining that sex could be worship, honoring the divine through intimate human acts. Here's the soul-destroying truth. The system was so psychologically effective that enslaved women competed desperately for better breeding positions, poisoning rivals' food, infecting competitors with diseases, practicing witchcraft to curse pregnancies. They murdered each other for the privilege of being raped by higher status masters, creating a culture where victims became enthusiastic accomplices in their own sexual exploitation. You thought temple-based intimacy was the ultimate fusion of religion and desire. That was just commerce. Wait until you discover the honorable tradition that preserved social status while bonding older mentors with younger companions. Picture this. You're 18 years old, standing in the private quarters of your esteemed mentor. He approaches with a solemn expression, not as a threat, but as a teacher. What happens next isn't aggressive or unexpected. It's part of a widely accepted custom. He positions himself between your thighs in a gesture considered both instructive and respectful. It feels uncomfortable by modern standards, yet those around you view it as a noble expression of admiration and guidance. This practice, known as intercrural contact, meaning between the thighs, was the most socially accepted form of physical closeness in structured mentorship bonds in ancient Greece. It wasn't just about affection, it was a symbolic arrangement. The older partner maintained his role as leader, while the younger preserved his dignity by not being placed in a socially inferior position. In Greek thinking, status was defined not by the gender of your partner, but by who held the dominant or guiding role. This interaction allowed both participants to retain their societal standing as men. It was seen as a compromise between desire and decorum, an outlet that preserved reputations and respected boundaries, at least within their worldview. Dozens of painted vases depict scenes of these mentorship dynamics, not hidden in secrecy, but displayed openly at elite gatherings. The artistic code was consistent. The elder figure shown in an active pose, the younger companion often turned slightly away, symbolizing modesty or social restraint. Greek poetry from the time often idealized these companions, comparing their appearance to divine figures and praising their grace. In one classical play, Achilles remarks to Patroclus, "I did respect the closeness of your thighs," a line symbolizing deep admiration through poetic metaphor. But beneath this ritualized system were rigid rules. These relationships were acceptable only while the younger companion fit a narrow standard, typically from mid-teens to early adulthood. As soon as the youth aged beyond this ideal, developed facial hair, or began asserting independence, the social contract dissolved. Continuing the relationship could bring shame or public condemnation. A society that once honored the companion's role could just as easily cast him aside. You thought this was the peak of socialized intimacy between age groups. That was only the physical tradition. Wait until you see the formal educational system that embedded these relationships into philosophy, citizenship, and civic life. Think about this. You're a proud father in ancient Athens, watching as the philosopher Socrates begins a formal mentorship with your 15-year-old son. Instead of concern, you feel pride. This is the moment your family has waited for. While it may seem uncomfortable to us today, in ancient Greece, this was considered the highest form of moral and intellectual education. These mentorships weren't fringe customs, they were foundational to how Greek society shaped its future leaders. In places like Athens, Crete, and Sparta, structured relationships between older men and younger adolescents were not only socially accepted, but celebrated. The mentor, often in his 20s or 30s, was expected to guide the younger student, typically between 15 and 18, in all areas of life: physical training, rhetoric, philosophy, public conduct, and civic duty. These bonds were marked by elaborate courtship rituals, symbolic gifts, and public recognition. In Crete, the process was even formalized. With family approval, older men would ceremonially take their protégés into the countryside for several weeks of bonding, training, and instruction. Upon return, the youth would offer a sacrifice to Zeus and receive special garments that signified his new social status. In Sparta, the custom was tightly integrated into the military system. Veteran warriors mentored younger recruits, not just in combat, but in discipline, loyalty, and moral strength. In fact, forming such a bond was considered essential. Men who didn't take on a protégé could be excluded from certain privileges. Here's the part that reveals the darker side. These relationships weren't just about ideals, they were also tied to wealth, status, and influence. Elite families competed to pair their sons with the most powerful mentors, offering gifts that resembled marriage dowries. In poorer families, sons could be placed into these relationships as a form of social mobility, even survival. What looked like education on the surface often masked a deeper system where youth, beauty, and influence were currency. Priceless artwork, land, and favors were exchanged, not purely for mentorship, but as part of a broader, status-driven economy. And if you think this structured mentorship system was unsettling, that was just the beginning. What happened to girls in the name of divine favor will challenge everything you thought you knew about ancient religion. Think about this. You're 13 years old in ancient Greece. Your entire life is shaped by ancient customs passed down for generations. As part of a deeply respected tradition, your family proudly prepares you for a ceremonial role, one believed to signal your passage into adulthood. To modernize, it's hard to grasp what this truly meant. Across Greek city-states, young girls were often dedicated to temples in the service of goddesses like Artemis or Aphrodite. These roles were seen as honorable and spiritually important. In Corinth, for example, families would make large offerings so their daughters could participate in what was thought to bring divine favor and future prosperity. At the Temple of Artemis, girls served as attendants or priestesses for a set period, after which they were released into society, often with elevated status. These rites were elaborate and symbolized purity, transformation, and alignment with the divine. Greek physicians and scholars of the time added a layer of philosophical and medical reasoning. They believed that certain stages of female development required symbolic transition, what they saw as necessary rites of balance, health, and spiritual readiness. This belief system created a framework where ceremonial preparation was viewed not only as religious duty, but also as physical necessity. What's most difficult to comprehend is how normalized this was. Parents were proud, communities celebrated, the girls had little say. It was part of a collective belief in duty and tradition. To us, this history is deeply unsettling. But in ancient Greece, these practices weren't fringe. They were part of mainstream society, blessed by temples, endorsed by medicine, and wrapped in the language of virtue. These 5 practices uncover a disturbing side of ancient Greek civilization, one often hidden behind marble statues and philosophical ideals. Beneath the surface of logic, democracy, and art, existed a society where deeply problematic customs were woven into daily life, endorsed by religion, protected by law, and immortalized in literature and sculpture. What we now recognize as exploitation was, at the time, seen as education, devotion, or even honor. This wasn't the behavior of a fringe group. It was central to how Greek society defined morality, beauty, and civic life. These were not accidents of history. They were structured, celebrated, and normalized by some of the most influential thinkers the world has ever known. Their legacy reminds us how powerful systems can blur the line between civilization and control, and how easily people justify the unacceptable when it's framed as tradition. If this dive into uncomfortable history challenged what you thought you knew, give this video a like and subscribe for more deep history stories that confront the myths we often take for granted.